Hi guys, welcome to another podcast. Today I'm joined with Dr. Laura Swettenham, accredited sports psychologist and currently a senior lecturer at Liverpool John Moore University. Laura, how are you doing?
Hey, Cabs. I'm good. Yeah, thanks for having me. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good. I'm really excited to talk to you. A lot of our conversation is going to be based around some of the research you've conducted and some of your experiences working in esports as a sports psychologist. Notably, one of the papers you wrote, I believe in 2020, was a case study where you focus on developing team cohesion. Firstly, before we jump into the deep end with that, what does a sports psychologist do, and how are they beneficial to an esports team?
Yeah. What does a sports psychologist do? Okay, might be here for a while, but let me see. I think one of the best ways to explain, I suppose, is just in terms of performance and well-being. So we're not just looking at performance of kind of players, you know, staff, teams, and so on. We're also thinking about the well-being and kind of the sustainability of being in a high-performance environment. Um, and often you'll see sports psychologists working at a few different levels. So I kind of alluded to it a bit before. So this might be kind of directly with the players. It might be working kind of with the coaching staff or working through the coaching staff. So kind of informing them in order to support players, for example. But then it also might be on more of a kind of like an organizational level where we are perhaps working with management to help create supportive and sustainable environments in terms of yeah, psychologically, so in terms of performance and well-being again. uh so yeah, in a nutshell, I would say most sports psychologists will work, yeah, in that sort of way. Some you might find will focus more on the player stuff, some might focus more on the organizational stuff, and so on.
Hmm. I think that's really interesting, the dynamic way a sports psychologist can be utilized. Obviously, we here at Transform Esports, we primarily look at supporting the coach. Um, what is that? What are some of those barriers or some of those challenges sometimes that a sports psychologist can face when trying to work with that coach?
Time, I think, is one of the main things, right? Esports coaches are super busy, um, often have a million hats that they're wearing themselves. So sometimes having the time to support is challenging. So it's maybe trying to get a bit creative around that, and also getting the coach to understand why it might be important for them, or understanding just what do they need at this point in time. Maybe they don't want to be overloaded with information, but actually just want someone to reflect with, someone to talk to. Um, so yeah, I think finding that time, carving out that time is difficult, but I think it's about, yeah, working with the coach and understanding what is viable, what is helpful, what's worth their time, in terms of the psychological support. Um, but I think certainly if we do that, then it can obviously impact the coach and the players in a really positive way. So
Yeah, I mean, as someone who's coached briefly in esports, I can definitely relate to the fact that it can become really intense and can be really full on, and it can become that can come on really quickly. Um, Oftentimes we see a lot of coaches, especially given how the scene's growing and the lack of sustainability across some of the grassroots semi-professional levels. Um, how can they still engage with sports psychology even if they don't have that direct access to a sports psychologist?
yeah. Um, I think one of the main things is trying to kind of develop your own self-awareness, potentially through reflective practice, which I know, Cavs, is something we've spoken about a lot before. Um, but whether this is as simple as, getting like a note page up on your computer and just reflecting what went well today, what maybe could I improve, and so on, then that can be a really good start to just developing this reflective practice, developing self-awareness, and so on. So it doesn't have to be anything complicated, but if we're just taking time to sit down with our thoughts and kind of, yeah, I suppose evaluate in a sense how our day has been. Yes, from a performance point of view, but also from just how are you feeling. Might even be like out of 10, what's your mood like today? Um, what was, the best thing that happened today? So also thinking about some of those positive things that can really get lost when we are so busy. Um, so yeah, taking a bit of time for that, I think can really help us to just put things in perspective and get a clear path forward. And yeah, you don't need a sports psychologist, you know, next year to do that.
Mm. Yeah, I think again, I echo that sentiment wholeheartedly. Before we started working together, reflection was something I often overlooked. I often saw it as a waste of time. But take sometimes just taking that time, that moment to just be still, made sure that next step I took was the best step to take, rather
Mm.
than kind of trying to run in as many different directions to find which kind of gate the key I was holding unlocked. There's a lot of different analogies that I've kind of just mixed into one. But is there what's like the simple, I know you've mentioned just kind of just writing down your thoughts, but is there like a simple process that a coach or even a player could kind of use to to guide their reflection to find the most actionable insights from?
Yeah, there are a few different ones. So I guess in coaching, perhaps more traditional sport coaching, you have kind of the plan, do, review sort of stuff. I say that's more based on like your, I guess, kind of your own performance as a coach. So kind of planning what you're doing, kind of putting it into action and then reviewing it. But we can also just have what is it? It's the why, why, how, maybe something like that. So you're kind of reflecting what is this specific situation that has happened that is perhaps important for you to reflect on. Um, uh, Kind of why is this important? I don't think I've got anyway. And then basically, why is it important? And then moving more into like actions, kind of what you're going to do next.
Mm,
So I think this is a good way if you want to look at specific situations and also think about why has this been important to you? So for example, if like you have um maybe had a bit of a bad day, maybe you're not feeling great, maybe something's triggered you a little bit,
mm,
reflecting on, well, why has that triggered me? Like why was that important to me? Why was that frustrating? And then you might start to understand even a bit around like your values. Well, actually, this player was disrespectful. Perhaps you then reflect on respect is something that's really important.
mm,
And then you might think about, well, what does that mean for me as a coach and how I coach and how I conduct myself and how I behave? Um, and even then, how might you respond in kind of a future situation? So reflecting specifically on situations like that, I think can be good. Yeah.
yeah, really interesting. And reflection isn't only limited to that individual scale. It's also massively beneficial to the team if opened up in that group reflection. In your case study, you talk a lot about developing team cohesion and facilitating it through psychological safety. These are typically bigger terms, more academic terms. Would you mind breaking down what these terms mean? So term one, team cohesion, and
Mhm.
then psychological safety.
Yeah, sure. So I guess team cohesion, I guess for me is about how is how's the team kind of working together, understanding one another, working as a unit rather than separate parts, and kind of how does that team come together in order to, yes, perform well, but also to, again, this sustainability idea, kind of work together on a sustainable level. And I think kind of within that, there is this importance of psychological safety. So within teams, so any team, not just an esports team or a sports team, like any team, there's this idea of psychological safety, which is um, really like, do I feel safe to voice my opinions within this group and to be heard? Um, so it's not about, everybody's on the same page and everybody's got the same opinions. It's not really about that. It's more about, do I feel like yeah, I'm going to be listened to, that I'm not just going to be shot down, and that we can have a discussion around these different opinions in order to come to a shared conclusion. And I think a really important part in this is the recognizing the power of kind of different perspectives within the team. So like if we all come in and we've got exactly the same perspective, we're probably going to be missing a lot of stuff. We're not going to be asking the right questions. We're all going to just be seeing the same things. Whereas we actually want a bit of variation within the team. And I think without psychological safety, that can come to conflict, I suppose, because we're seeing the world in different ways. And
Mm,
therefore we might not understand each other. So I think a part of, and I guess from the case study, what we were trying to do is to help people see the way in which their teammates saw the world and perceived things in order to gain a better understanding for where they were coming from, rather than just thinking, well, I don't agree with you.
mm.
Um, yeah.
Yeah, so just picking up some themes there, it seems like psychological safety has a lot to do with sort of building trust and building that rapport, that connection within the team. But then it's also something that facilitates quality conversation. It's not just this idea
Mm.
of, yeah, I agree, let's move on, but it's this idea of, oh, you might be right, but I think this way. Is there room to fit in this sort of thinking? Is that an accurate way to sum up that description there?
Yeah, I think so. Like I say, it's that quality conversation. It's not like there's just one person sort of leading that. It's getting multiple voices in, and that can get messy. But I think it's yeah, having those conversations, being able to voice them and have a way in which to kind of work through those conversations. And like you say, having that trust there, that trust is really important. Um, and as you mentioned, that relationship in the first place. So we need to have some sort of foundation of a relationship before we can start asking tough questions.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's always super critical. It's one of the foundational things, qualities any high performing, really successful, consistent team kind of achieves. Finding that understanding of psychological safety is really, really key. Now, moving on to like focusing primarily on team cohesion, it's obviously really important for players to want to get along and manage to get along both inside and outside the game. At the time of when we were recording, we've just a lot of the teams in the tier 1 League of Legends system are now going through playoffs, and for that means for a lot of teams, it's some of their last games because there's going to be a winner or a loser. And I was watching some of the games, and one of the interviews I watched from one of the North American teams, the player just said, "We never managed to click." Um,
Mm.
and that's it. It's always such a sour. It's like a bittersweet thing to say, especially when there was like they achieved some level of success, obviously not the success they wanted. How does a coach or how does a team go about clicking? What is not clicking and what does clicking kind of look like? What's the distinguish there?
Clicking and not clicking. I think the first thing that's come to mind, and obviously this it'll be different for different teams, right? But I think the first thing that's come to mind for me, and links actually back to some of the feedback I got from that case study, was this idea that we're doing stuff that isn't just in the game, right? So we're not just turning up to scrims, we're not just playing, we're not just talking about, League of Legends all the time. There's something else. There's something else as well as that. So we are not, the only reason I'm showing up is because I have to play with these guys, right? There is something more beyond just us playing together. I understand you on a personal level, or I know that we both enjoy other hobbies that we can talk about. Um, it's almost like if we think about having like a work relationship with someone, it's not really going to move much beyond just being acquaintances if we just talk about work all the time.
Mm,
It's like, what else is this person about? What do they care about? What's their background? Um, and some of the I always get it wrong, this acronym, but it's like the personal and mutual sharing stuff. So the disclosure work, basically getting people in a group and getting them to share their story with one another.
mm,
Um, Anjali Agrawal has actually got a nice case study out on that um, in esports. So again, it's this idea that people are sharing something about themselves, about who are they as a person. So we kind of understand and respect people on this deeper level. And I think
Mm.
that can be important to get that click. Um, yeah, you're not just on that surface level, but there's something more that connects us all.
Yeah, I think again, it's comes back to this idea where we're not just isolated boys in the ocean, but there's some thread that holds us together, that pulls us towards one another, that is often seen in successful teams, or even if they can't achieve the results they wanted, they can walk away feeling like they gave it their all. It's like a genuine, true, fruitful experience. As a
Mhm.
sports psychologist, where do you kind of, or not even as a sports psychologist, but as a coach, once you've kind of started getting them to bring some of those skeletons out the closet and start sharing a bit more personally, where do you go next? How do you translate that to maybe some of the on field performance, some of the more competitive performance? What are you looking for? What are you trying to do to facilitate further embedding team cohesion or a really cohesive team?
Mhm. I think it's again like the first thing that's come to mind to me is this idea of autonomy. So giving players autonomy, giving them choice. So for the coach, not just um I guess not just being that sole voice and sole decision maker, but allowing the team to get involved in discussions, allowing them to have some choice around what might we do next. And this is something that is often quite uncomfortable, right? As a coach, it's like,
Mm,
oh, I don't really want to almost like make it messy by getting multiple voices involved or by um, you know, not making the decision. And of course, the coach can kind of still have that final say, but hopefully the coach is able to listen to what the players want, what the players need, and kind of integrate that into what they're doing. And I think what that does is it allows the players to feel, again, like they're trusted by the coach.
mm,
Um, and also hopefully that they're trusted by the players around them as well. So I think what it facilitates, so that kind of team cohesion is this ability to have those conversations in a meaningful way rather than, like I said before, in a way that is more filled with conflict. So I think it's kind of using this cohesion to have discussions, make decisions together.
mm,
And what that's hopefully doing down the line is creating more independent players. So once, they go into that match and kind of you hands off, you let them get on with it, they have the skills to be able to work together as a team rather than being like, what does the coach want me to do? I've got I've got no idea what they say. So we're creating independent
mm,
players rather than ones that are potentially driven by fear and fear of what if this is the wrong thing to do,
mm.
but actually driven by, you know what, my teammates have my back, my coach has got my back. Let's do this.
Yeah, I think that's something we also really talk about in the skill acquisition space is like the independent problem solver. It's about not just someone who, if I as the coach can tell you what to do and they do it, it's not as good, then it's not as like shiny, as if I can help them figure it out for themselves, because I'm not going to be there when they're competing.
Yeah.
And even in like traditional sports where the manager can be kind of talking to the player on the touchline, typically it's really hard to try and figure out what's happening on the football pitch, try and keep up, and then listen to your coach anyway. So how
Mm,
much of what the coach is saying is really getting embedded? So developing that independent problem solver, that independent thinkers is so crucial. And I think using autonomy to feed that in can be really useful.
yeah, yeah. And I think, like you say, it's also that, like, is it just information overload? What are they actually hearing you say as a coach? What's going in? What isn't? What's important in this moment for them to know? Um, and yeah, I think kind of that process, like you say, of um, yeah, being independent, being able to make the decisions for yourself. It's not. it isn't an easy path kind of for a coach to take, I don't think, because I think you will likely come across quite a bit of what we might feel is failure, but is
Mm,
actually kind of part of that learning process. And actually, if we can, in a sense, kind of lean into that failure and allow players to feel supported if they make mistakes, then that could really help us when they get to that, get into that match. Maybe things aren't going well, but there's this word around like resilience, I suppose, that we hear a lot of.
mm.
Um, and yeah, yeah, if we can feel more comfortable with that failure and feel more supported by it, by our team, by our coach, then that's going to help us to recover more quickly when things don't quite go away.
Yeah, I think you could even start talking about, when someone's not able to really cope with those mistakes or those underperformances. We talk a lot about tilting and a lot of these things in
Yeah.
esports as well. Obviously, with esports being primarily a cognitive domain of performance, sports psychology and the learnings and the information from those is massively useful. Coming back to this case study, in this case study, you talk about delivering a workshop about overcooked and undercooked strengths. Could you talk us through a bit about what that means? How did that workshop come about? And how does someone use that knowledge to kind of monitor their own level and their own headspace?
Yes. Okay. So this idea of overcooked and uncooked strengths. So I guess um it's I guess a strengths-based approach kind of to sports psychology. And we all have the idea that we all have our main strengths, but our strengths can turn into our weaknesses if we use them too often or even at the wrong time. Um, so what I was doing here is I had kind of a one-to-one chat with each of the players in the team, and we started to build their like profile, if you like, of their strengths. So discussing with them like what does it look like when you are playing at your best? Like what are you doing? And that's perhaps indicating some of this like sweet spot we call it, where their strengths are kind of just in the right place and they're really like doing their job, if you like, versus what happens when let's say you're really low energy, you just kind of don't care and so on. This might be more undercooked. What sort of things might you be doing? Versus like overcooked, which might be you're getting frustrated, um maybe getting a bit tilted. What's happening now? What happens to this strength of yours? And so they can start to see this kind of variation in their behaviors based on how they're using their strengths. Um, and so what we're trying to do is support them to be in that sweet spot more often, but also to get their teammates to kind of help them with that as well, and vice versa.
Mm,
So we kind of did these profiles and then um, did like a team sort of sharing session where they shared their profiles with one another. Um, and then it might be, for example, like, okay, you're tilted, you're overcooked. What does your teammate need to know in this situation? What sort of thing might they be able to say to you to help? Or actually, do you just not want them to talk to you at all? Give me like a few minutes and I'll bring myself out of it. But perhaps by knowing that, I'm then not getting angry and shouting at my teammate because I know, all right, they just need a few minutes and we'll kind of see where it goes, you know? So it's how do we work with each other? How do we support each other to help us be at our best more often? Um, and something I wish I did with this, which I didn't, was getting the coach to do one as well and
mm,
share that with the team. So, what are your strengths as a coach? Actually being vulnerable and saying, what does it look like when you're undercooked or overcooked? Um, and again, how can the teams kind of support you if that happens? Yeah. And I think in terms of, so with the team I did this with, the coach there was really good at kind of taking this language and using it with the players. So they might be checking in with them and saying, it looks like you're a bit kind of undercooked right now. Kind of what's going on for you? Like, what do you need? So using the language in training to help to create this, yeah, shared language and shared understanding. So it's living in the environment rather than just being something we did one day that then we all forgot about.
Yeah, I think it's this idea. I love one talking about strengths because oftentimes I feel in a lot of high performance environments, it's so much easier to just focus on the things that aren't going well than the things that contribute to the success as well. Whether it be in the VOD review, whether it be in the tactical approach is like we don't want to do this, rather we should look to do this. Just even using language that way can be really beneficial to a lot of players. But bringing it back to kind of that sweet spot, what can take someone out of that sweet spot? What are some of those variables? What are some of those factors that can pull them either way, whether they end up burning the dish that they're making or whether they try and give you raw chicken and some salmonella possibly?
Yeah. Okay. Again, loads of different things, right? And it will be very kind of unique to the player about what this is, maybe even change on any given day. But I suppose some of the things I've come across, it might be obviously mistakes is a common one. So making a mistake, perhaps losing, an advantage. Um, it might be to do with one I think is quite common is if a player isn't playing to the level that they thought that they would. So if they assumed that they would go in and be absolutely flying and playing really well, but then actually they don't meet their own expectations, that can sometimes, well, can often be very frustrating, right? Um, it can also be down to, of course, communication. So whether this is that there's too much communication or that there's too little. Um, it can also be to do a little bit with like motivation, more so on this undercooked side. So if a player maybe feels like, what's the point? Maybe we've lost this. What is the point? Or maybe they're even just a bit tired that day. It might be more of an undercooked side. And I think some of the players, I think in that case study said they ended up kind of playing more for themselves rather than the team,
Mm.
rather than, yeah, rather than working together and communicating. It was like, oh, whatever, I'm just going to do my own thing. So I think they're probably some of the main things. So mistakes, kind of perceived failure, if expectations of themselves aren't matched, and then kind of communication. But I'm sure there's loads more we could come up with.
Yeah, for sure. I think there's so many variables, and there's so much nuance that we can dive into. Kind of diving into something that you've touched with expectations. Usually, expectations bring along pressure, and the esports athlete they compete in areas where there's pressure always,
Mhm.
even if there's not negative consequence, especially when they're playing solo queue where they're playing for their in-game rank or they're playing competitive and given the shortened time scales for a lot of careers, there's a lot of
Mhm.
pressure with that. What are some advice that you could give a player on managing that pressure, but also what are some advice you could give a coach that they could take to their players to help them fully understand what's going on inside their brain and how they can help use pressure to find their sweet spot.
Yeah, yeah. So for me, so I take what we call like an acceptance sort of based approach to a lot of my work with players, like one-to-one work. So the essence of this, I suppose, is that say if we are feeling a lot of pressure, it's not that we're saying that isn't real. It's not that we're saying, let's just get rid of that pressure. We can't get rid of that pressure, right? So part of it is about turning towards that pressure sometimes and trying to understand it a little bit more, talking about it. And through doing that, we can create a bit more acceptance of it and we can create an understanding of kind of that it's part of the job, right? And it's asking ourselves the question, is it, am I willing to experience pressure in order to be an esports player? And if the answer is yes, then you can go and, be an esports player with this pressure alongside you. And if it's a no, then maybe that's not something that you want to be doing. Um, but alongside that, we can also, help to, I guess, help players to get a bit of space away from some of the challenging emotions and thoughts that they might have to do with pressure. So yeah, we want to accept it and have it there, so it's not kind of pushing us around as much and getting in the way. But we can also do things like just increasing our ability to be present, ability to recognize some of these maybe negative or unhelpful thoughts. Um, and instead really like committing to meaningful behaviors. I think that's
Mm,
one of the key things is we can ruminate so much and get so stuck in our heads, right? Um, that we fail to act, we fail to kind of commit to like meaningful behaviors. So this might be out of the game. So like what am I doing for myself that is important to me, that's meaningful, but also what am I
mm,
doing in the game that is important and meaningful. So I think it's a range. So I guess kind of to summarize, I think it's acceptance that uncomfortable stuff is going to come up. There will be pressure. I think it's an understanding of why you're doing what you're doing. Uh, why is this meaningful to you? And then having some coping strategies, whether that's being present, but then also being really clear on what behaviors, what actions you want to commit to,
mm.
um, even with pressure alongside you. And that can help us just to make, even just to make decisions. So I know actually what are one of the key things in this moment that I want to do, like what's important right now for me.
Yeah, I could also, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but if every individual was able to kind of make sense of that for themselves, that adds on to kind of that strengths profile. When they share it, they can say, these are my strengths and this is what I would like when things go wrong, or these are some of the behaviors I might exhibit when I'm feeling pressure. This is the support, this is how I deal with it. This is how I like receiving support, all that things, and just being able to articulate that can help develop that cohesion in that team when things might go wrong. Because even if you win every game in the split, that doesn't mean you've had a bumpless journey. There's always going to be bumps along the way. Some
Mhm.
people hit bumps that can break a wheel off, but some people might just get a bump, which means everyone in the car just gets, oh, we might be going a bit too fast here. But there's always a bump somewhere or the other, and just being prepared for that is becomes really, really useful.
Yeah, yeah, totally. And I like how you link that back to the profile. So yeah, it's the behaviors in that are important and they can create a bit more clarity. And therefore, it's important that those things on that profile are to do with actionable behaviors, not just like in my sweet spot, I'll feel confident. Like,
Mm.
not that's very like emotion based, and we can't control our emotions a lot of the time. So it's more like, what's the behavior? What's the action that we have control of? Not, yeah, I want to feel confident.
Yeah. Yeah, it's kind of a bit more specific. It's like you need that specificity, and sometimes
Yeah.
if it becomes hard to articulate some of those things, what are sources that players can use to kind of help derive their strength space? If that makes sense as a question.
So, how can players explore what their strengths are? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, if they don't fully know how to articulate it, and if they are coming up with answers that are quite just broad, how can
Yeah.
we help them develop that specificity?
Yeah. I guess one question I always ask is if I had if I had a video camera and I was filming you when you were like playing at your best, what would I see you doing? So getting them to really just spell out it's that behavior. So on a camera, if you were filmed, what are you doing?
Hmm.
Um, and that maybe that's kind of actually in person. Maybe that's more, you know, like they're championing game. Like, what are they doing? Um, but it's having, yeah, getting at what would it look like? What would I see? Those
Hmm.
sorts of questions.
So like kind of like if I was to sit in your room, what would it look like when you're playing and you're getting frustrated or you're not performing at your best? What might you see? Are you someone who's throwing the controller around or punching the
Yeah.
desk, or are you someone who starts leaning down and down in your chair, right, or whatnot, right? And when you're in your sweet spot, are you someone who's, able to just move on when a mistake happens? All of these things kind of get them to articulate that. I think that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
The last thing you noted in this case study was sometimes you felt that, or some of the feedback that you got from the players was they didn't believe that their teammates were being as
Yeah.
authentic or as honest with you as a sports psychologist. I, as a coach, always have felt that sometimes players don't want to give me the true answer, especially in that public setting, even sometimes in that private setting.
Mm.
I understand a lot of it comes with having proper psychological safety, or well perceived psychological safety. How do we go on and build authenticity within that dialogue between either player to player or coach to player, while we're still aiming to build psychological safety?
Hmm. How do we build that? Again, I think a lot of it comes back to this idea of trust. It's like if I'm going to share what I actually think with you, are you going to treat me differently? Are you going to punish me? Are you going to be defensive
Hmm.
and kind of challenge what I'm saying in a I guess a not nice way? But I think this is always a challenge that we have, and often people will want to tell us what we want to hear, um, rather than perhaps how they actually feel. But I think what potentially can help with that is, again, we talk about reflection, right? So if you're having regular reflection sessions and the players start to get a bit of evidence for actually, if I speak my mind, I'm not going to be shot down, I'm
Hmm.
not going to be punished, and so on. I have a bit of evidence that actually my coach wants to hear this stuff and that they value it. And I think also the other way as well is like, as a coach, how are you role modeling those sorts of behaviors and being vulnerable and actually sharing how might you be feeling about things? Um, so I think there are a couple of things I would probably start with. One, coach modeling this sort of vulnerability, but also providing the team with evidence that they can speak their mind freely, and that's actually what you want. Um, yeah, but it's tough. I remember getting that feedback and thinking, like, how am I going to know? Like, what do people actually think? Like, where does this put me?
Hmm.
Um, so yeah, it's tough getting that. But again, we've got to show that same trust back to those players that actually yeah, I trust what you're saying to me here. Um, yeah, and unfortunately, we're not gonna win them all, so to speak. And I think I remember kind of talking to I can't remember who it was, but I think another sports psychologist about this, and they reminded me of that rule of thirds. So like a third of people are gonna love
Hmm.
it, third of people gonna absolutely hate it, and a third of people are just gonna be on the fence.
Hmm.
Um, and so I think sometimes there's a bit of kindness that we need to bring ourselves. So for me as a psych, or as a coach, um, that it might not be perfect for everybody. Um, yeah, yeah.
Well, that's so brilliant. I think just having this kind of conversation in and of itself just helps me reflect a lot on some of the things I might have done in the past. I think just out of this conversation, I've now realized there's moments where I might not have exercised trust completely correctly. There are times where I might have let down a player. Maybe something's been said in confidence, and it's kind of been thrown back in their face, and it's never a nice feeling when that happens. Um,
Mm,
if you were to give coaches advice now, obviously a lot of coaches right now are in their off season, and many of them will be joining or joining new rosters, working with players they might have never worked with before in 2025 or even in the Winter Cups. Where, if you could give them one advice on establishing some team cohesion, what's like the biggest bang for buck thing um,
mm,
that they could start working towards?
yeah. I think one of the key things, it's probably what we hear quite a lot, but in that pre-season phase, spending time together as people, not just as players,
Mm,
try and get some vulnerability going, try and get some of those vulnerable conversations. Of course, vulnerability needs safety in itself. And you don't want to kind of bring up, or you need to be aware that it might bring up some difficult conversations. Um, and I suppose have some avenues of support if challenging things do come up. Um, but I think creating space for relationships to grow organically, if you can. I know that can be difficult if we're working online, but maybe it's as simple as just playing a different game together.
mm,
Um, Having a conversation about something a bit different. Um, I think those sorts of things, I guess we might call them like team building activities sometimes. Um, but for me, I think it's more this allowing authentic relationships to grow, understanding one another more. Um, and I think getting the players used to reflecting together, having those open conversations. But then also for the coach, maybe having a bit of your own time to reflect on what you're doing. Like you said, I think earlier, Cabs, kind of helping the coach to gain clarity over that direction they want to move in rather than it being like a high speed, bullet train. Like taking a bit of time to pause and think, all right, what am I actually doing here? How does this align with how I want to coach and what we're working towards? So
mm.
I think, and maybe in a nutshell, it's reflecting as yourself as a coach and also reflecting with the players. Um, yeah.
Thank you. I mean, as always, you bring some like a bucket of knowledge everywhere you go, Laura. So it's always such a pleasure to chat with you. I think there's so much more that we could obviously dive into. So maybe part two or part three of an episode in the future is definitely calling. But I think it's good to cap it there to keep this nice and concise. So thank you so much, Laura, for your time. We'll link the paper down in the description of the video for everyone to go read, and then obviously your socials, if in case everyone wants to pick your brain any further. So thank you so much, Laura.
Awesome. Thanks, Cavs. Yeah, great to chat. And I'm sure we'll, yeah, come back soon with part two. That'd be cool.